If you're one of the many people who has had issues with tracking on Webinar Jam or EverWebinar, you are going to want to make sure that you watch this video. I've got Chris Mercer from measurementmarketing.io to give us his ingenious solution to the problem. More on that right after this. Webinar Jam and EverWebinar tracking. It sucks. And so that's what we're talking about today. We've got Chris Mercer, the man from measurementmarketing.io. Chris is an absolute stud when it comes to tracking. And so I want to talk, Chris has put together some solutions to help people who've struggled with measurement or with the Webinar Jam, EverWebinar tracking stuff. Put together some amazing stuff he's making accessible to you. So just wanted to kind of chat through, Chris. First of all, welcome. Thank you so much for being here with us. Super excited.
Appreciate it. Yeah, definitely. Feel free to call me Mercer. Everybody does, man. That's not a lie. Like, it's weird when people call me Chris because I have to think about, like, which Chris are you talking about? But
I love it. So Mercer's with us today. Let's talk for a second just so people kind of have some perspective. I know most people, if they have experienced tracking issues with Webinar Jam or EverWebinar, they're very aware of it. Yep. But I want to make sure for anyone who's using it but doesn't really understand what's going on or where they're potentially losing data, let's just kind of talk about what, if people have got UTM tags, the ball's getting dropped as people sign up for those webinars. So can you kind of explain what's happening?
Right, yeah, absolutely. Let me share screens real quick. So we have a little demo site that we have that kind of describe this. What I'm going to do, I'm going to dive into a little bit of some stuff that's slightly technical, but it's just the skill. So I'm just going to emphasize that. So if you haven't used this stuff yet, it's practice makes perfect, and eventually from a tracking perspective, you're going to want to use things like this. There's an extension called GA Debug, so the Google Analytics Debugger. You can install that, and that's what it does this. So I just kind of popped into our Chrome DevTools here so I can see this stuff. But I wanted to explain why this is happening. So essentially, Google Analytics has this little user ID tracking thing here, right? This is their version of the user ID. It's called Client ID. That's how they know the difference between every single person. What happens is, you can see here I'm on the demo site, and this is my Client ID. And so if Facebook, let's say I sent Facebook traffic to this page, so far, it's going to say, cool, this client ID is the Facebook traffic. So I'm going to associate this client ID for this session, this visit, to this Facebook traffic that's coming through. So far, ends in 383. If I then go into the webinar registration page, okay, no problem, it's still 383. See that? So I've got a bunch of stuff loading up. Again, the details of that aren't too important. Just know that it's client ID 383. Then I go to actually register for the webinar, and this is what the default settings are. So what happens is all of a sudden, see that where it says 351? So the client ID just switched. So what that means in the Google Analytics world is, to Google Analytics, it's, like I said, remember, client ID is user ID. So it's a brand new user ID is what's just happened. So Google Analytics now goes, oh, okay, well, some other user just showed up. But now when you say, oh, well, how many registrations did I get on Facebook? You can't tell, because that stopped up here when it was 383, right? The original one. And now all these other 351s that are coming through, you can see they're all this Gendy page. This is the Webinar Jam domain. So the challenge is, and this is why attribution breaks in Webinar Jam, or EverWebinar, both the same system, the client ID is changing. And so your challenge, kind of from that measurement perspective, to be able to track through this and make sure you've got attribution, and you can go back and say, okay, Facebook caused this, or Google Ads caused this. The way to do that is making sure those client IDs don't switch. And that's not the easiest thing in the world to do, but the first step is knowing why it's even happening, right? Where that break actually is. And this is something called cross-domain tracking, where you have to go from one domain to another. And so that's what this does. And that's really the essence of the problem here.
Cool.
Does that answer that?
Yeah, absolutely. So anyone in the AdSkills arena knows I talk about Frankenstein websites. So it's websites that look like they're the same, but they're actually made up of different pieces.
Yep.
So if anyone who's watched Tracking 101, they've been able to see me do this exact same problem when it comes to Shopify. We're talking about it on Webinar Jam.
Yep.
But the cross-domain tracking is the big issue here. So number one, we have to fix that. But I want to talk us for a second about the problems that this is really causing you.
Yep.
So number one, you talked about there's 2 separate sessions being created for every single person. So that basically is doubling all of your web traffic for anybody who clicked to register. That's a huge issue, right? So we basically,
that's exactly right.
You're overestimating the number of users. That's problem number one. Problem number 2 is when you don't carry across the sessions for the same client ID, you lose all of your UTM tracking. So if you've got UTMs built into your Facebook ads, all of a sudden you end up with direct none traffic on your actual registration page. So you're losing all of that tracking information moving over. And that's why you can't see your reports inside of Google Analytics, even if you've set up your tracking correctly from the tracking link perspective. All of that information gets lost. And so this is really like the crux of things, is you're duplicating, as you see right now on Chris's screen, he's got 2 sessions for one person, And if we go to traffic sources, he's going to show you that there's probably one that's coming.
They're both going to be direct none. So that's because they're legitimately direct none. But let's prove that point, because I think it's a really great example here. So if I go to, let's just keep on this page. So I UTM this, and we do this all the time just when we're testing stuff. So medium equals test. So this would be like your tags, right, that you might set up, you should be using when you're doing all of your tracking. So let's call this test, test, test. So when we do this and we load this up, what should happen in Google Analytics is, if I didn't break my sessions, or I should break my sessions, we should be able to see that come through. There it is. So there's our test test. So now if I click here, I'm just seeing test traffic as it comes through. So now when I go to the register now, and I know I'm on this page because I just sent a bunch of page view stuff into Google Analytics. I know this, I'm on this page, but here, if I go to my content to say, okay, what page are you currently on? Well, Analytics still thinks I'm on that same page because that's where the session broke. So now if I take off this test, you can see this page does load up. So it does know that I'm there. And that's kind of to your point. Now, if I go back to traffic sources, it's going to go, oh, okay, well, this is direct none. And again, just to prove that this is the page, I can click here. So I filter for it, then go to traffic sources and you go, okay, this is coming through as direct none. So it has no idea, that, like you said, I'm another user, and it has no idea where I came from. So traffic attribution's gone.
Exactly. So I think that's a problem. Whenever I've talked with people that run webinars, they don't understand, is my Facebook traffic, is my YouTube traffic, is my GDN traffic, what's actually producing results? Yep. And when you break these, this client ID, that's really your problems. Is it looks like you have way more traffic than you actually do, and you can't tell where anything originated from. So you don't know where to invest your money to say this is where the juice is worth the squeeze.
Exactly right.
That's really the piece here of just making sure it's abundantly clear the problem that people are facing and really the ramifications of it. So now let's dive in. Chris Mercer being the genius that he is, let's talk about the solution that you guys have come up with. I think it's brilliant. And I just want to make sure that as many people know, as much as big of a company as they are, they haven't fixed this problem on their side. You're the person doing this. And so I want to make sure that you get the credit for this because this is massive as far as what you've been able to help people achieve.
I appreciate that. And to be fair, like we stand on the shoulders of giants. So we're learning skills from everybody else that is out there teaching this. We just sort of combine things in a slightly different way and working with, I'll give a shout out to one of our certified measurement marketers, which is Ahmad Kanani over at SIAVAC. It's SIAVAK.com. And he really helped spearhead this movement to sort of say, okay, let's do the scripts and let's come up with the idea and test everything. But it works really, really well. So there are, in cross-domain, there's like different levels. There's like the beginner level, which is pretty easy to set up in Tag Manager and Google Analytics. And again, if you're crossing across the domain, meaning just the page itself is going from your domain to, like in our case, we're using Infusionsoft, so go to Infusionsoft.com and then back to our domain for the thank you page. That's kind of typical cross-domain tracking, fairly easy to set up with Tag Manager. Then you have iframes. So iframes are a whole other animal, but the iframe, and there's things out there to Google that. So if you're using iframes, and you should know if you are, then that's a whole different way of setting up cross-domain tracking. Again, it's fairly simple to do it, even there's a little bit more steps to it. But that's with Tag Manager again. And Simo Ahava is a great guy to follow on things like that. So if you're learning Tag Manager stuff, SimoAhava.com, he's got a couple of great ways to do that. Then there's this challenge, and this is what sort of levels it up, because this actually does use an iframe, but the problem with typical iframe cross-domain tracking is typically the iframe is loaded when the main page is loaded. So you load your page, and then on that page is an iframe that's loading, and you can set up the cross-domain tracking because the page knows the iframe is there. But in this case, the page doesn't know there's an iframe. It's just a little JavaScript button. When you click on this, that pops up this register box, and that's your iframe. So this is one of those situations, and booking engines and other things like this, you can probably take advantage of this technique for those, because this is one of those things with the iframe, you are going to have to set up cross-domain tracking for an iframe, which is already slightly complicated. But in this case, it's a delayed iframe. So you have to go one step further, and you got to start making sure that the page is able to tell the story of what's going on. And if the page knows what's going on, then you can tell Tag Manager, okay, here's some stuff to do. So in our case, what we have to do is, or this is what our solution was, and I'm going to start at the very basics, just for people that don't know that you can even do this in Webinar Jam, because this is an important first step. So this is the back end of our Webinar Jam. This is the webinar we did the test on. So if I go to edit, where the very first thing you have to do, no matter what, not an option, you have to at least set this stuff up, is you're going to go into your integrations. And when you go into integrations here, it says we're integrate a third-party tracking system. This is where people just don't realize they can do this, I think, in a lot of cases. This is where we put our Tag Manager script. So we put it everywhere. So the registration page, the form, which is actually what we're tracking right now, and that iframe is that form, the post-registration thank you page, webinar live room, and the replay. So everything gets Tag Manager, has to, not an option. Because if you don't do that, then you have no visibility at all anyway, right? So it's already game over. So you have to set that up first.
Quick timeout. When inside a Tag Manager, there's two scripts. There's a head tag and a body tag. Which one goes inside of these fields?
Both of them go together. Because none of these are actually going to go into the actual head. You can't control it that much. So it's being inserted into the body anyway. So we take both of them and smash them together. And then pop them in there. Smashing is the general accepted jargon for that. But you can see here, right? So here's our top script. And then right underneath it was the bottom part.
Perfect.
So we just put them both in there. Now, if you have the option, or if one day they change that, put it in the head if you can, or the body. But generally speaking, and Infusionsoft's like that too. When you customize Infusionsoft forms, for example, it says it's like in the head of the form, but it's really not. It's in the body, so you can put them both together when in doubt. All right, so that's the very first step. That at least gets visibility, and that gets us to this part where we can set up tracking and click on buttons and see the page views and all that stuff. That's how I'm lighting this up in Google Analytics, right? Because I just pasted my Tag Manager script on there and it's firing in that stuff. So already that part works good enough. At least I see the page loading, whereas before I wouldn't even have that. But I still have that problem of, okay, it's really not telling the proper story, right? It's not giving me that useful truth that I want. So that's what we're going to do now. And essentially what we have to do that, and I'm going to bring this over because it'll help to, I think, kind of explain what happens. So in this, here we go. So we have our page set up and you've got your little register button. What we're going to do is we're going to set up a system. So the client ID, this is something that Analytics does on its own, sets a client ID. We're going to set a system that the parent page is going to start communicating with that iframe. Okay, so that parent page is going to start communicating with the iframe. So in this case, the iframe pops. And what we're going to do is we're going to set up a listener here that's going to listen for the iframe to talk to it. And we're going to set up a listener technically here that's going to listen to the parent. So we're going to basically set up a way for these things to talk to each other. And this is not, the scripts themselves to set up and to copy might be a little complicated to create them, but these are copy-paste scripts. So I'll give you a link to where you can pull these up in a moment here. But the idea is that you set up these listeners, so now these two pieces can talk to each other. It's important to do that, remember, because the iframe does not exist when the page first loads. It only exists once that button is clicked. So you need a way for the iframe to say, hey, I'm here. Now I need information before I can go tell Google Analytics that I'm here. In particular, I want your client ID. And that's what we're going to tell it to do. So we're going to say, we're going to have the parent, the iframe pop up and say, I'm here, I now exist. It's going to tell the parent page that. The parent page, when it hears that, is going to pass its copy of the client ID into the iframe. And then, and only then, when that has that client ID, then we tell the iframe, okay, now go tell Google Analytics that you exist. But now it tells it with the right client ID, so everything stays stitched together. So that's kind of the overall.
So you're essentially, just to reiterate that, you've got a listener from the parent and from the iframe. You're listening to each other, and you're essentially causing a delay that's not going to load the Google Analytics script until it's received that client ID.
Exactly right. Because if this Google Analytics script fires right away, it's going to set its cookie, right? It's going to create a client ID. It's necessary. It can't not have a client ID. It has to have one. So if I do this and I say, okay, well, I'm just going to fire a page view, that client ID is going to be different, right? It's going to be XYZ or whatever it's going to be. And so I still have that break. But instead, what we're going to do is we're going to say, okay, this is going to say, I'm here, I now exist, but I'm not doing anything from a measurement perspective yet. I'm going to tell the parent that I'm here. And then that parent is going to copy that and then push it over so that this iframe can now grab a hold of that. Now that it has that, then it tells Analytics that it's here.
So beautiful. So just making sure, you made this extremely simple for people to understand. I know we're going to go through the code work, but I want to make sure people understand this is something that takes people time to develop this code. And so what you've done here is you guys have gone through and planned this out, and Mercer is giving this away to you because he wants to help you succeed. So I just want to make sure that we do our correct props in saying, thank you guys for developing this. This is a problem a lot of people are dealing with, and we're really excited that this is something that we can share with other people to say, if you're struggling with this, this is something that Mercer and measurementmarketing.io have developed. I want to make sure it's abundantly clear this is not something that exists out on the internet. It's you guys have gone through and created this to solve this problem.
Yeah, definitely, and I appreciate that. You know, like I said, I'm always real big on like we stand on the shoulders of giants, right? We're all learning this together, and this is just our way of kind of giving back too. Because, like you said, this is a challenging problem that just has multiple levels to it. And so, instead of having to come up with your own solution, it's like, hey, you can copy and paste this stuff and at least get something more useful than where you currently are. All right, so you want to take a look at kind of what this thing looks like?
Yeah, let's see it in action.
Let's do this. So I'm going to. We already talked about what it looks like in the beginning with the problem. Okay, so where I was flipping client IDs, you can see everything was sort of already broken. I'm going to change this stuff up here, and we're going to do some new UTMs, so I can kind of do a whole different one.
And quick thing before you hit enter, after campaign, you have an underscore and you need an equal sign.
Oh, good point. Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
All right. So then we've got so source test two, campaign test two. All right. So now we click into this. This is going to pull up our page, and we still have our 383. What I'm going to do is I'm going to turn on preview mode, where we already have this situation set up. And this is going to kind of activate the fix. You can kind of see before and after. So we're going to wait for that to go on, refresh. All right. So now we've got our preview mode set up. So what's happening here is in Tag Manager, we have our scripts. I'm going to pull this away just a little bit. So remember, 383 is kind of our client ID that we have. So I've got all of this stuff set up, right? So I've got our little events coming through and everything else. Watch what happens when I click on this Register Now button. Assume this works the way we want it to. See right in here, there's an event. This is actually saying, hey, I need the ID. And I'll pull this over so you can see it. Zoom out just a little bit so you can read it. There you go. iframe needs client ID. So that's coming from this iframe. So what's happened is the iframe's loaded up. It says, hey, I need the client ID. And then the client ID gets pushed into the iframe itself. And right behind here, so watch, this is kind of a little iframe magic with previews. So there's actually a preview window for this iframe behind this iframe, behind this preview window. So here, you can kind of see where everything looks like. I'm just going to click this and minimize it, and it's going to show something different. Hopefully, there we go. This is our other iframe. So this is the iframe that is from the iframe, the preview for the iframe here. So now I've got the iframe saying, okay, I'm going to, page event, DOM ready. Then it says received client ID. That's the iframe signal that, okay, I have what I now need. Now I'm going to go ahead and fire into Google Analytics. And that's what should, in a perfect world, get our client IDs all situated out. So I'm going to pull this over. And so I'm going to go all the way to the top. So we've got our Google Analytics on the session starter. We're at 383, and we're on the measurementmarketing.io page. And then as that customer journey, right, as we're tracking through the customer path, I'm still on measurementmarketing.io, different events that are being passed through. Now I'm on Gendy. There's a page view event. You can tell I'm on the Gendy page, but I'm still 383. So client ID remains intact, which means in analytics, I can come through here. I see now it's not one user. It's not two different users. It's still the one user. And if I go to traffic sources, you can see that on that page, I'm on test 2.
So let's go to content real quick and hit last 30 minutes. And it should show both of these pages, ideally, that this is showing up. It's going to show the measurementmarketing.io is the historical with the test 2 traffic source. And then it's currently on the Gendy
let me go back to, let me just show test 2. So that now we're just looking at test 2 and then content.
So this is the
historic page, right?
And then if you go to active, this should be the Gendy.
Where I currently am for the next few minutes, and then it'll fall into this one.
So for people that are not tracking wizards, hopefully that shows you at least now we're tying the two pieces together. So this information can pass through and you can actually do conversion tracking utilizing your UTM parameters, which makes a huge difference.
Right, exactly. Because remember, this says test 2 just for example, but it could say Facebook, right? It should be saying Google or whatever your traffic source is that you're trying to track through. Your email, right? Anything that you're trying to track through could be in there, webinars, whatever. So let's do this just to also do a little test. Let me make sure it tracks all the way through. And then here I am doing it myself. See, you got me doing it too, man.
Who's Chris?
I know, right? So I'm going to say plus test at. Lets me take it out if I need to. All right. So now I'm on the thank you page. Okay. So now I've got thank you page set out, and what should have happened. This is where I like to trust but verify. Just because what we should be is that this thank you page. See that? Yep. Now we're on thank you. Also 383. So now I go into analytics.
Did you have to set up an additional cross domain for this as well, or just as long as you're passing the iframe, you're good?
As long as you have traditional cross-domain set up. So we're making the assumption. So remember, we're leveling up for the iframe thing. We're setting up little signals.
Yep.
But the cross-domain, you still have to set up traditional, everyday, normal cross-domain tracking.
Cool.
And that's also why in this webinar Jam setup, you have to do everything. Right? Because if I didn't put my code on the thank you page, it would have just gone dark right there. And I would have been able to track up to the point where they saw the registration form, but to your point, not the conversion of the registration form. Now I can actually track the conversion and associate it to the traffic source that actually caused the session to happen in the first place, which is kind of the holy grail when you're trying to track through stuff like this.
Totally. So if anyone has been through AdSkills Tracking 101, I've taught you how to do cross-domain tracking, so you'll be able to do this. Now it's just really this piece of essentially what we're doing is taking that client ID and punting it over to that iframe so it can actually move forward. That's really the big sticking point for you. So as long as you cover this particular section. So let's talk about how in Tag Manager you actually implemented these code snippets to make sure that people understand what's going on here.
The fun parts. Okay, so I'm gonna use this along with our tools, with the thing that everyone's gonna have access to, so that you guys can just come here and copy and paste stuff. So this first thing is the Google Analytics client ID itself. You have got to grab that. You got to tell Tag Manager to go ahead and grab that. We use a custom JavaScript variable to do that in Tag Manager. So we just copy and paste this part, and that ends up in your variables. And you'll go down and just create a custom JavaScript. So we just kind of name ours like that. So custom JavaScript variable, and this is client ID. So we're just copying and pasting that in. Okay, it's the same script. The only thing that you need to adjust on this is just making sure it's got your UA, right? Because it's looking for a specific Google Analytics ID.
Yep.
So in this case,
just to pause here for a second. If you don't have this set up as a variable, you're going to go into your UA account. It'll say UA dash something. That's what your analytics ID is. If you haven't set that up as a variable yet, you should do that because it's a constant and it's just going to pull in that particular number every single time it sees that.
Yep. And it's better to use a variable because then if you ever do change this, you change it in one spot in Tag Manager and everything else that's using it automatically gets updated. So that was, kind of the first copy and paste thing to do is to grab the client ID. Because the Tag Manager itself needs to understand what the client ID is so that it can pass it back and forth. Otherwise, if you don't create a variable, it's not in the hands of Tag Manager. Tag Manager really can't do anything. So that's the first.
Making sure we give credit where credit's due. That's a Simo JavaScript, correct?
Yep.
Well, thank you once again, Simo, for everything.
Simo's, like I said, shoulders of giants, man. That guy's amazing. And definitely absolutely worth following. If you use Tag Manager at all, that's definitely worth following him. So set up the listener is a second step. So remember we talked about the listeners. There's one on the parent page. It's going to be one of that iframe page, the Webinar Jam page itself. So the first step is set up the listener. This is, again, just sort of a copy and paste script that we've set up. And so what this does is this listens for a message coming in from the iframe. Okay, so that's all this is doing. It's listening for a message coming in from the iframe. So copying and pasting. Go ahead.
Just to be clear, just making sure that people take a step back. So we're creating a tag that's living on the registration page prior to the iframe being clicked, right?
Yes, but so just to keep it clear, I'm going to call it parent page.
Okay.
So it's the page that's hosting that registration button outside of the Webinar Jam registration page, which might be different, just to keep the confusion down.
Yep, makes total sense.
Yes, exactly right. On your domain, the parent page that has that blue button on it, that's the one that you want to reference for sure. And this is the listener script. Again, copy and pasting in. There's really nothing to adjust on this. So this is just listening for information from the iframe. It says, okay, I'm ready to actually receive something. So that's just a copy and paste, again, activated on, we just did it for all the measurement.marketing.io pages. You don't need it for the Gendi pages because they don't need to listen, right? So we did it for our domain. So that was the only customization we did here. And this is just our way of setting this up to say, page URL contains measurement.marketing.io, right? Just whatever my domain is. So your domain. So that's the first sort of main script that you're going to do. Let me go back to this. So that's the first thing. So set up the listener for the parent. Then you set up the listener on the webinar page. That is your registration box. Okay, that register box in this case, that is the actual iframe you're trying to track through. So this one has that same listener, but then also has this other component, which is, okay, it needs to send information back to the parent, right? And so that's what this part does here. And that's how you get that iframe needs client ID right in there. So to show you where that is, that's just another tag. So we've got the listener for the Gendi register box. And Gendi.com is just Webinar Jam's domain. So that's it. So we copied and pasted this in. This is the main listener bit. And then the part that says, okay, I'm going to pass this through. And again, if I change this and said, you can make this whatever I want. So iframe ready, I just need to make sure I change the signal to be iframe ready, right? Whatever you want to do. But that's how that gets there. All right. So that's again, copy and paste, right? So we have these two copy and paste listeners that are on there. Once we have the listeners on there.
So time out. I just want to make sure very quickly. So I think how are we triggering that tag to fire?
So good question. This is just going to fire. So this is our Gen D registration box. This is just going to fire on these particular iframes, right? Which is the gend.com/registration box. And I'll go back to our page real quick. So how do we know that that's the page to fire it on? You see this URL. This also shows in analytics. So this events.gend.com/register box. That's the actual register box page itself lighting up. We don't need it to show on the thank you page. It doesn't need to do anything on the, so that's why we just said on /register box.
Okay.
So pro tip, make sure it's case sensitive. So register box with a capital B, because if you just do lowercase, it wouldn't work. So notice the little registration box, capital B. But that's it. So that basically says only when that iframe pops up is when this script should be activated, right? Only when that iframe pops up. So then it says, okay, I'm now listening and I'm ready for my client ID. At this point, nothing else has happened. So then what we do is we have the next step. So you've got your two listeners, one on the parent, one on the webinar side. Then it's okay, when the parent, right, when I hear that thing that I'm listening for, which is I'm ready for that ID, then I'm going to go ahead and pass through the client ID. Okay, so then I'm going to pass through the client ID. And remember, the client ID was the thing I grabbed in the very beginning, right, which is why we set that up first. So we've got the two listeners, and then when it gets sent back, what that looks like here, so this is the send client ID to the iframe. So this script is what sends it back, right? Has the client ID. This is the client ID I created earlier, right? Our little variable for that custom JavaScript client ID.
So can you just show people very quickly how you insert this variable inside of here?
Yep. So if you needed to, so a couple ways to do it, but this is the easiest. Just start typing little brackets and then whatever you think that you're looking for. So client ID, and then you're like, oh yeah, that's what I want. This is also why I name everything with the little, identifier of what type of variable it is, because sometimes I might be pulling that from the URL or something else. So I'll put that in there. But that's how you insert those variables in there. So really simple. So now you've got that. And then the only thing that we do different from a firing trigger perspective is we basically tell the parent, I need you to wait. Do not do this. Don't tell the iframe with the client ID. Don't send this to the iframe, right? And all this is this is the actual iframe it's going to, the gend.com page itself. So don't send it to the iframe until you are told to, until you're told that that iframe is ready, right? Because we don't want to do it when that page loads because there is no iframe yet. So you have to click the button, the iframe pops up, the iframe says, hey, parent, I'm here. It says iframe, needs client ID. The parent, that's how the parent knows, which is this right here, this event that comes through, custom event. So when you see iframe needs client ID, then and only then do you execute this script, which sends back to the iframe the client ID and technically pushes it into the client ID, the data layer for the iframe. So that's when the iframe actually now has the client ID. Okay, it's got that, and it's going to get an event. The way that the iframe knows is because it's going to get this event called received client ID. So that's how the iframe itself knows that it can now do whatever it needs to do for analytics purposes or measurement purposes.
Got it. So can you go through that trigger real quick? I just want to make sure that people understand what that looks like.
So this is a custom event. Okay. So and the custom events, just to catch everybody up, that's all this stuff down here. So let me pull this over. So you have all these different things of custom events. So that's what these are. And you can set that up. So if I go back a couple of steps, here's our awesome webinar. So we've got everything coming through here, right? No custom event that says, I need you to fire this thing at all. But if I click on register box, now I see iframe needs client ID. That's my custom event that I told it to look for. So now iframe needs client ID fired the script for the parent to send its client ID over to the iframe. So now the iframe has it.
So let me take a step back and make sure that people really understand this. So when that button is clicked, which piece of code is sending this custom event?
At this point, right? So we're going to click on this register now.
Yep.
This does not do anything. This is not a trigger for anything. This pops. This is just basically the way the Webinar Jam works, right? This pops this. The very fact that this loaded is the trigger because we told Tag Manager to only load the listener for the register box on page views where it's a register box.
So just making sure, I just want to make sure. So we go back to that code that you just showed.
Yep.
So in that one right there, the actual piece of code. Yep, this one. This is where it's being told to fire needs.
So this is where it starts listening for something to come back, right? It starts listening for a signal, so just the listener part. Yep. Then it also has another script that says, go send to the parent, right? Go send to the parent the iframe needs client ID signal as
so
an event.
Just make sure that people understand. So this second piece of code that you've got only firing on the register box is what's firing this event. And then what you're triggering, that ability to forward the client ID, is based off of this script loading. So I think people saw it. I just want to make sure when we break it down for them, it really makes sense from the perspective. When this box loads, it's sending an event, you're firing from that perspective saying, okay, now that the box is loaded, you can punt that client ID over to the iframe.
Yep, that's exactly right. So here is where it's iframe. So this is the iframe needs client ID. That sends the parent to the iframe itself, right? So that was the script. So now when this loads, it should have a received client ID. Again, remember there's two different previews, one for the iframe and one for the parent. This is the parent one on the bottom, so I'm going to minimize that. And now you can see here that the iframe received that client ID. Okay, so the iframe passes through once it's alive, right? It says, oh, iframe needs client ID. Cool, I'm going to fire this script. This script passes through the client ID along with the event received client ID, which is how we know that it has it, right? So if we just did client ID, it'd be there in the data layer, but it wouldn't do anything with it. You have to have this event that's received client ID, because that is our signal that when you receive client ID, page view. And that's how analytics actually gets its final step.
Beautiful. So once again, you have built the code to do all of these things.
Yep.
I think the page triggers is something that people understand at a very easy level. So understanding that needs to fire on the parent page and the iframe. The biggest thing I want to make sure people really understand is you're firing this last piece of script when that event triggers. So that's why Mercer has inside of his tag manager that custom event is what the trigger is for that final piece of code.
Yep. So so the custom event that fires the client ID, and then finally in the Google Analytics end of things, right? You've got two page views, one for the measure marketing.io pages and the Gen D and everything else. Basically everything that's not a register box, because these register boxes we need to treat differently. So then we say fire this page view only on the register box, and that only fires on that custom event of received client ID.
Got it.
Otherwise it's just generic page view, regular page view.
Beautiful. Okay. So just to make sure we recap. So you're setting up script on the parent page and on the iframe.
Yep.
When the iframe loads, it's firing a message. It's firing a custom event that says client. We basically need the client ID.
Yep, exactly right.
That triggers the next piece of code to fire the client ID over.
Yep, which then fires our page.
Yep. And then the last thing we do there is we fire that page view after the client ID is received. So now that GA has what it needs to actually pull that through.
Yep. And so that's kind of visually perspective. This is what we're doing. Yep. So we're going to set up the listener. iframe needs client ID, right? So when the iframe loads, it goes, I need the client ID, kicks this off, sends the client ID, right? We already have that variable. So it gets passed to the iframe's data layer. The iframe listens for that. When it has that received client ID, then it fires the page view.
Got it.
Meanwhile, this page view is just firing. It's a regular everyday page view on everything, except we're just blocking it to fire in register box, because that's a different page view tag.
Got it. So you're setting up 4 different tags for this. You're setting up the 2 that are firing on the page views, and you're setting up 2 that are firing on custom events.
Yeah. So technically, this is a tag, which is the listener that sends that I am here, right? That lets the iframe know that it's here. We've got the listener here. We've got the script that actually sends the details into the data layer. Okay. So those are like the 3 main tags that are script tags. Okay. And you've got the 2 Google Analytics tags. One is everything but the register box pages on Gen D. One is specifically for those register box pages. These are little iframes. So that's another 2 tags. So you've got a total of 5. And then you've got that one custom JavaScript variable, which is the thing that's grabbing the client ID. And that's what actually gets pushed into the data layer. And at that point, you do need to set up one other variable, which is that's how we know to basically override this page view tag and say, no, use this client ID, is we're creating a data layer variable to read that client ID the iframe has. So I'll show you kind of where that is here. So in our variables, actually, I'll show you here first. So when you see client ID, if I go to the data layer, you can see in the data layer this post message data, and then under post message data is the actual client ID, right? This is the one that was sent from the parent. That's the actual value. So it's important. This is what we need to be able to tell Google Analytics, no, use this client ID. Don't make up one on your own, which otherwise it will do. So we override it. So now we've grabbed this. So we do that with the data layer variable. That looks like this in your variables. So the data layer variable, client ID. In this case, we had to tell it, go into post message data. And again, the only reason that we did that is because it pushed it into this first. And then we go one level deep and then say, go find client ID. That's what the dot does. So post message data, then dot, right? Go one level deeper into that and then go find the words client ID here and return back with that value. That's how that gets set up.
Okay, so that's our variable. What are we doing with this variable?
So in this relates back to that, how that page view tag is handled. So if I come back into here, so we got our regular everyday, this is the normal page view tag that everyone's kind of used to, right? Pretty generic and everything else. This one is the register box pages. So when we click into that, there's a slight difference here. See where it says enable override settings? I'm going to edit this real quick so you can see it. So what we're doing is we're saying use the standard settings, except in this case, I want you to override and use client ID. So we click into more settings field to set. And this is, you just type this in, it'll show up as one of the defaults. So select that. And instead of using the client ID or coming up with your own, I want you to use this one instead. Use this value, which is the one that's sitting in the data layer variable. And that's how that gets there. And then that's how everything's all stitched together.
Beautiful. So I think that's the most important piece is as you're working through this, you're basically setting up 4 different things. Mm-hmm. The last one that's most important is the GA tag that's only firing on the register box. You've already sent the client ID over. Now you're going to fire a page view, but you're replacing the client ID that it was going to generate on its own with the client ID that you've sent over.
Exactly right.
Beautiful.
Exactly right.
So for those of you who don't realize, yes, I know Mercer, we're standing on the shoulders of giants, but this is something that so many people ask questions about on a daily basis. Mm-hmm. And it's really something that the information that you're putting here is going to help people really start to understand their data better when it comes to webinars and what's producing results for them. So thank you so much for taking the time today. Sure. Number 1, your scripts, you said that you're going to provide a link, right? We'll go through and get that built into here so you can look through and see these. Yep. And then from there, biggest thing for me is if you're not already following Mercer, measurementmarketing.io, amazing individual. He's also in AdSkills Pro League. So if we've got questions, I know we're going to have AdSkills students that have questions about this. Mercer's available inside of there. Obviously, he's got his own stuff, but he'll get to questions whenever he can. I'm in the same place, happy to answer whatever questions we can. Just want to make sure this is something that you're getting set up for success.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's a lot of moving pieces. And for anybody who's kind of like, man, this is just like way over my head, that's okay. Like it was for me too. This is something that you cannot just watch and then get, right? It's like watching me ride a bike and then all of a sudden you're a better bike rider. Like, of course not. You need to actually practice. So just go nice and slow, try things out. And like I said, sharing it and asking questions of others. And there's probably other ways to do this as well, but at least that gets the basics in place and you'll see it function. So as long as you follow this step at a time, it should work for you. But like, like this says, always trust but verify, right? Always go back and test it on your own just to make sure. But we're here to help.
This stuff is super important. Make sure you take the time. Go to measurementmarketing.io. Check out what Mercer's providing. He's got amazing resources. We can do something to support you at AdSkills. We're here for you. But thank you so much again for the time, Mercer. This is awesome. Really appreciate you making the resources available to people and also being available to answer questions. We just a huge fan, and we'll do whatever we can to support you guys because what you do is amazing.
No, I appreciate it, man. It's definitely, I think you guys do an amazing job back there. Like I said, I've been in the group. There's lots of intelligent questions and conversation back there in Pro League. So happy to help out and provide value wherever we can.
Awesome. Well, thanks for the time today. I appreciate it, and have a great one.
Thanks, you too.
If you found this tutorial helpful, make sure you click on the subscribe button on the screen right now. Also, if you'd like to join the Daily Edge and get the daily dose of what's working in paid traffic and tracking, you can text Daily Edge to 44222.